Hey there, Game Jammers! The Diversifiers for Global Game Jam 2021 have been released. Diversifiers are optional constraints that you can add in addition to the theme. You can use up to 4 diversifiers to add those additional constraints to your game. They are a great way to add a little more challenge and inspire creativity for your jam. If you're looking for the theme, head over to the keynote video, but then please come back here to learn about the diversifiers. Let's go through the list and talk a little bit about each of them. The first category of diversifiers is the sponsored diversifiers. These come from the sponsors of the jam, and typically they're going to be aimed at getting jammers to use a specific technology or push for a specific strategic goal of the company. Both of these different kinds of sponsored diversifiers can make for interesting design decisions, especially if they ask you to use a technology that isn't commonly used in-game. But we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to the meta diversifiers. The core exercise diversifier is sponsored by Manticore Games, and it asks you to use the core game's platform and use at least one community content item from another jammer. There is a prize pool of $10,000 to be awarded for this diversifier. Destination Happy Place is sponsored by Unity, and it asks you to make a game that includes the journey or the process to get to a place or a state of mind that makes you happy. Creating a play-fabulous game is a diversifier sponsored by Microsoft that asks you to identify the best strategies for your game loop by using PlayFab experiments. Virtual Wallet is sponsored by the IGDA Foundation, and it asks you to use the Web Monetization API to make a web game that uses an alternative revenue model. More information on this is available in the video description. Unlikely Allies is sponsored by Virtuos and asks that your game supports multiplayer crossplay between mobile and PC. The next 2 diversifiers are sponsored diversifiers that I think go very well together. It's You and Me Kid is sponsored by the Carina Fund, and it asks you to create a game that is designed for families to play together and secretly features math. The Possibilities Are Endless is sponsored by Endless and asks jammers to create fun-first educational game that captures the attention of children and educates about STEM. The Feels is sponsored by Sony, and it encourages jammers to come up with designs that take advantage of controller feel and game feel. If you're not sure what game feel is, check the links in the video description. Elevate is sponsored by NextNav and it asks you to create a game that uses a vertical location in some way. This is one of those ones that I talked about earlier that could be very interesting because we're using a technology that might not be very commonly used for game development. All right, that's it for the sponsored diversifiers. Up next are going to be the accessibility diversifiers. Accessibility is about making your game accessible to a larger audience. So up first we have A11versary. I'm not really sure how to pronounce this one, so sorry if I butchered that. This diversifier celebrates 10 years of accessibility diversifiers by asking you to include a tutorial and to have no reliance on sound or color alone, and have a one-button controller. The kitchen sink diversifier asks you to give players a choice between at least 3 different types of input devices, and they include eye tracking and potatoes as examples that you can try building. This can be a really fun one if you have someone on your team that's interested in building a custom controller, or if you're interested in experimenting with new ways to control a game. Spinal Tap asks that the game has a separate volume slider for different types of sound effects, such as footsteps or gunshots. This is actually a really easy feature to implement, and I would recommend creating a different volume slider for each of the characters' voice actors in your game, assuming that your game has spoken lines. All right, from here we are going to move on to the art diversifiers. The first one is Are We ASCIIing Too Much?, which asks you to build a game that uses ASCII art. For a team with artists, this might look like Stone Story RPG, but this can also be a great diversifier for a team without a dedicated artist. You could build a game that uses colored ASCII symbols as tiles for your game's tile map. You could create a text adventure with a tool like Inform 7 or Twine, or you could use a mud code base to build a small multiplayer experience. Double Take asks you to have moments in your game that appear different when viewed from a different perspective. The example they give is an ambigram, but don't limit yourself to things like that. This could actually make for some really interesting mechanics in a game like We Were Here, where two players have to work together and communicate over voice chat to solve puzzles. The two players could see the world differently. Photogrammetry asks you to go for a walk and collect or photograph 3 to 5 objects that you're going to incorporate in your game in some way. Get to the Point challenges you to make your in-game art in a pointillist style. Basing your game's art on a real-world art style can make for some really interesting experiences. Black Velvetopia is one of my favorite levels from Psychonauts, and that level feels like walking through a black velvet painting. It was an amazing level. Up next are the audio diversifiers. I recommend using at least one of these, especially if your team does not have a dedicated audio engineer. Many Game Jam games don't include audio, and this is a great way to get some interesting audio into your game and to get your whole team involved with the creation of your game's audio. Theme Song is a diversifier that asks you to build your game's tutorial in the form of a song. This diversifier goes really well with the earlier diversifier that asks you to include a tutorial in your game. Wilhelm asks you to create a game where the characters can only communicate by screaming. It's named after the Wilhelm scream, and you're probably familiar with this scream, even if you don't know it by name. Vocalize asks you to develop a game where every element in your game is voiced by synthesized speech or a narrator. You could have someone on the team narrate the gameplay similarly to the Stanley Parable, or if you have access to a tool like a VoiceRoid, you can have a synthesized narrator. Additionally, a tool like a Vocaloid can be used to build your game's tutorial to be sung by a synthesized voice, so you can do not only this diversifier, but the theme song diversifier I mentioned earlier. All right, next we have the code diversifiers, and there are only 2 of these. The first one is RNG, which asks you to use randomization on something that traditionally wouldn't be randomized, like the player's jump height or gravity. This one can be kind of challenging because a lot of the things that you could randomize in a game could potentially break your game or make it unplayable. Lull code is the second code diversifier, and it challenges you to write your game in an esoteric programming language. I recommend against this diversifier if you are a first-time jammer, but this can be a really interesting challenge for a more experienced jammer or programmer. One of the things that I like doing during game jams is forcing myself to learn a new tool. However, I'm not going to try developing a game or really anything in white space or Malbolge. Up next, we have design diversifiers. First, we have moving the goalposts, which asks you to develop a game where the win condition of the game changes some way every time the game is played. This particular challenge is not that hard to pull off if you do some research on procedural generation. Murphy's Law is a diversifier that asks you to design a game where the goal is to fail in as many ways as possible. And this could make for some games where you create several very funny ways to lose or die. So you might have several different hilarious possible game overs. It makes me kind of think of the old Choose Your Own Adventure books. Duetto asks you to create a game of 2s. For example, it could be a game that is for 2 players that is playable with 2 buttons using 2 sounds, and the art uses only 2 colors. So as many things that you can push down to the number 2 as possible, push for that if you're doing this challenge. Smells Like Success asks you to design a game that you can play with your nose. Now this one could go really well with the kitchen sink diversifier, and it could make for some really weird and some really interesting gameplay. How many of you are in there is a diversifier that asks you to make a game where the character is controlled by multiple players. Now, if you've heard of Twitch Plays Pokemon, then this diversifier probably sounds very similar. If you're looking to create a game like this, you could create a game with Twitch integration that allows the chat of a Twitch room to play the game. Now, alternatively, you could create a game that uses the inputs of multiple controllers to control a single character. All right, we're down to the final two categories of diversifiers. Next, we have the narrative diversifiers. The first one is fake news, which is a diversifier that asks you to create a game that focuses on the topic of disinformation in some way. This is actually a pretty timely diversifier, and you could develop a game that is intended to teach your players how to identify misinformation or how to evaluate the veracity of news sources. Games Are for Everyone asks you to give a traditionally underrepresented group a voice in your game through either the characters or the narrative of your game. Starlight asks you to design a game where the world is inspired by stars and constellations. Now, this made my mind instantly go to Stellaris and Endless Space, but there are tons of other ways that you could handle this in other genres of gameplay. Our last category of diversifiers are the meta-diversifiers. Now, some of these are going to be about how you develop the game rather than about what's inside of your game. For example, our first meta-diversifier is on the safe side, where you are challenged to make a game alone or in a team where all the members are at least 100 kilometers apart. If you want to do this one, I recommend going on a team rather than trying to go it alone. A lot of the benefits that you get out of participating in a game jam is that you get to work with new people. Solo jams can be a fun challenge, but I've honestly always had a better experience working on a team. Tu B'Shvat has arrived is a diversifier that celebrates a Jewish holiday that lands on this week, and apologies if my Hebrew is not quite right. This diversifier asks you to create a game that is set in or around a tree. A Party sounds like a really interesting diversifier to me. It asks you to create a game that can be played during a video call. Now, this goes really well with the next diversifier, which is titled Next Slide, Please. This is a diversifier that asks you to make a game entirely in PowerPoint or some other presentation software. Most developers feel comfortable working in a game engine like Unity or Unreal, but it is entirely possible to develop a game in Excel or in PowerPoint. There are tons of platforms that were never intended for games that you can use to develop games. And the final diversifier for 2021 is Snail's Pace, which is where your game is designed to be played over multiple days and it cannot be sped up. I hope that some of these diversifiers have inspired you or given you something interesting to experiment with during this year's Global Game Jam. If you use any of these diversifiers, please let me know in the comments. Let me know how development went during your project, and feel free to include a link to your game's page on the Global Game Jam website. If you like this video, then please hit the like button down below, and please make sure to subscribe if you would like to see more daily game industry updates.